All right, I think we're ready to go. Here we go. So today, being Rosh Chodesh Kislev, I thought it would be an opportune time to start out something new. And the idea will be to be ma'ayin, to look into, to discuss and Yonim Chassidus from the Rebbeim, the Chabad Rebbeim, that haven't necessarily received the proper attention. And we're going to try to find them and single them out and discuss them and see what's interesting about them. I don't want to get into long hakdamas here. Maybe on some other occasion we can elaborate at some measure of greater length about the concept here and the idea here. But as the Rebbe says, let's jump into it. Just for some framing, some context, the clickbait title that I am envisioning for this year is why do Chabad chassidim drink vodka or get drunk from vodka? A rare torah of the Alter Rebbe. So essentially, this is a torah of the Alter Rebbe about the practice of drinking alcohol. And it's actually very timely because it's actually connected to this very specific day of the week. It's connected to Monday of Parshas Vitzä, as we shall see. But first, a bit of background before we jump right into it. Just some background, some historical backgrounds to this Torah and what's going on here. So the general historical background you need to have is that we know that the Alter Rebbe did a shidduch with Chernobyl. We know there's Chabad, there's the Hoif of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, the dynasty that started by the Alter Rebbe, and there's the Chernobyl dynasty, started by Reb Nachum of Chernobyl and his son Ramatul of Chernobyl, and then Ramatul had many children. They opened various branches, but they're all more or less under the umbrella of Chernobyl. Today you have Chernobyl, Skver, Achmistrivk, and you have Tolna. There's a Maisid in Flatbush, Makarov. Maybe there are others that are out there as well. The Tursky family, as their family name is known. So that's another major Chassidish dynasty in that general area in Ukraine. And the Alter Rebbe did a shidduch with Chernobyl, namely that the Alter Rebbe's granddaughter, the daughter of his son, the Mטשערנוביל, married Reb Yaakov Yisrael of Cherkass, the son of Ramatul, who was the son of Reb Nachum of Chernobyl. And this shidduch happens to be pretty significant because as a result of this shidduch, ultimately the Frierdiker Rebbe was a descendant, was a scion of this shidduch. I think we'll get to the details a bit later. But overall, what you need to know is that this was a shidduch the Alter Rebbe did, and this was one of the chassinists in the Alter Rebbe's family, in the Alter Rebbe's generation. The other chassana is the big chassana in Zlobin, where the Alter Rebbe did a shidduch with Rebbe Vitzä of Berditchev. Those are the two tzaddikim with whom the Alter Rebbe was mishtadech. And in recent weeks, I dug into a whole separate Torah of the Tzemach Tzedek about shidduchim that I believe sheds light on the Tzemach Tzedek's actual approach to his family shidduchim. And in that context, I get a bit more into the details of the shidduchim done by the Chabad Rebbeim, but that's for another time. In fact, we know that in the context of the shidduchim, the chasanas between the mishpacha of the Alter Rebbe and Chernobyl, we know from Chassidish Mekayres that there was some kind of run-in, there was some kind of clash between Ramatul of Chernobyl and one of the Chabad Rebbeim at a chasana regarding the style of how Torah is said in Chabad. Ramatul of Chernobyl was of the opinion that the Chassidus Torah shouldn't be said at such great length, and we'll intend to get to that in greater detail later on. So that's the general background that one ought to know, one ought to be familiar with going into this. But the chiddush here is, the novelty here is that for some reason, only about a week or so ago, it was pointed out, I discovered that one of the mamarim in Torah Dibra Maschal Ela told us if you look in the Marmakaimis in the back, they note that on one of the Kisveyad, the Kisveyad of the torahs of the Rebbeim would often have a Keseris, would often have a bit of a line at the beginning with details regarding the date on which it was said, or any other notable details regarding when and where it was said. So, for example, when Alter Rebbe went on a trip in Tafkuf Ayin, you can trace the Alter Rebbe's travels from the locations that are written in the Keseris to the Mamarim. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such a detailed breakdown of his travels. Stuff that's noted there as an example. So, and the whole culture of Chabad Kisveyad, especially back then, is worthy of its own discussion. And if we keep this going, we'll probably touch on it from various angles. But anyway, so in this Maimer, Ela told us that in Torah, one of the Kisveyad, it says, Shabbos Tnaim im harav Mטשערנוביל Chayref Taf Kuf Samachtes. So we have three details here. The date is that it's the winter of Taf Kuf Samachtes, but it adds additional details. It says it was the Shabbos Tnaim with harav Mטשערנוביל. So that pretty much tells us that it seems like, as we'll see, it was Ramatul of Chernobyl. Menachem already passed away at this point. Ramatul of Chernobyl, it seems, came to Liadi in the winter of Taf Kuf Samachtes, and it's a drush of Toldos, so surely it's Parshas Toldos. Came to Liadi to do a Tnoim with Alter Rebbe, and they came for Shabbos, and apparently they celebrated the Shabbos as the Shabbos of the Tnoim, as we'll see, it was before the Tnoim. So Ad Kadei Kach, the Shabbos got the title of Shabbos Tnoim, and recently I've actually written about the musig of Shabbos. Today in Chabad you have a Shabbos Kala, which is an event for the Kala on Shabbos before the Chasana. In Israel, they also call the Ofruf the Shabbos Chasan. That term I haven't found in Chabad. Amol, when they would get married on Friday, the Shabbos, the Chasana went into Shabbos, they would call the Shabbos Chasana. These types of terms and terminology. So here we find Shabbos Tnoim with the Rav Mטשערנוביל, Chayr of Taf Kuf Samachtes. So it's like I said, it seems like the Rav Mטשערנוביל came to Liadi for Shabbos, and during the Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe said, Ma'amarim Chassidus, Chayr in his usual style, and L'chayr in the presence of Ramatul of Chernobyl. This is a Chiddush. I somehow had not been aware of this before, and this seems worthy of looking into and discussing. But moreover, then was pointed out to me as well, additionally, by someone else, that it's not just the one Maimer in Torah. There's actually a series of Mamarim from this Shabbos through the day of when they wrote the Tannaim. And particularly, he pointed out to me that one of the Torahs from this series of Torahs is entitled Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina. You don't hear of a Maimer, a Drush, a Torah of Alter Rebbe every day that's called Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina. So it sounds like it's something interesting. It's a short shtickle on not a typical topic that you expect to see. If you want to see the list of Mamarim from this period, you can look at the end of Mamad Admar Azken, Tafkuf Samachtes. At the end of the volume, they have a list of all the Mamarim that are linked to that year, as of when they printed that volume. Sometimes the details can change, new things can be discovered, or dates can be corrected, but as of when they last printed it. And a number of those drushim taka have evidence in the manuscripts that tie them to the Shabbos, and specifically mention the Matul of Chernobyl. So there's this drush, Smoile Tachas L'Reishi, which in Torah has the Dibra Maschal Eila told us that I mentioned before. So like I said, one of the Kisveyad says Shabbos Tnoim Im Harav Mטשערנוביל Chayr of Tafkuf Samachtes. There's also a drush Vayomer Yohanes and Mocha Chodesh, which stems with the Kvias. So similar to the Kvias this year, that Shabbos was Chavtes. You can look up the Kvias of Tafkuf Samachtes. Shabbos was Chavtes Chashvan, so it was Taka Mocha Chodesh. And in HaTorah, somewhere in one of the Rishonos of the Tzemach Tzedek, when he refers to this drush, the Tzemach Tzedek writes, Mocher Chodesh told this Tafkuf Samachtes, V'hiyois Haram Mטשערנוביל. V'hiyois sounds like a Hebrew translation, approximation of Yiddish, when the Matul of Chernobyl is given. So, Benet is given, you don't have to finish the sentence either, you could say, Benet is given. So in Hebrew, bihiyos, when he was there. So the Tzemach Tzedek, many years later, is still referring back to this drush as that was told us Tzemach Tes when the month of Chernobyl was there. So that's at least two from the Shabbos that are linked to the month of Chernobyl. And then there are a number of drushim that seem connected to the day of the Tannaim themselves, which, as we shall see later, took place 2 days after Shabbos, Taka on Monday of Parshas Vayetze. However, the Kviyas then, unlike this year, Cheshvan was Chaser, so Sunday was already Aleph Kislev, and Monday was already Beis Kislev. So what the three drushim, one is about Teled Odas is Yaval, which is appears in Torah Parshas Bereshis towards the end, and we don't have a Ksav Yad that explicitly links it and says with a title that says it's from the Tannaim, but based on the evidence in the Ksav Yad, it seems to be from this time of the year, and we know that Tzemach Tzedek seems to have chazered it at one of his sons' chasanas, and from the Teichen of the drush, it seems to be dealing with Shira, with Simcha, so it seems linked to Simcha. There's also a drush Hamagd Mereshis Achris, which is literally based on the nusach of the Shtar Tanaim. Shtar Tanaim, of course, is its own discussion. And then there is Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina Taka, the Torah of the Alter Rebbe we're going to discuss here, and there's a maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek from many years later, in which the Tzemach Tzedek chazered the Teichen of this Torah, and in the Rebbe Marash's Rishima Hanacha of that maimer, the Tzemach Tzedek, the way the Rebbe Marash writes it is, Hine Rabbeinu Zal, and in parentheses, Be'ez Tanoim Shel, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, Im Harav Mordechai Zal, Amar Inyan Chamar Medina Mahu. So when the Tzemach Tzedek repeated it all those years later, and the Rebbe Marash wrote it down, also made a point of noting that the Alter Rebbe said this by the Tannaim of Yaakov Yisrael with Mordechai, the Tannaim of, just the terminology is that the Tannaim of Yaakov Yisrael, he's the Chassan, the Tannaim were with the Alter Rebbe and the Mordechai, the two Mechatanim, that made the Tannaim with each other for Yaakov Yisrael's Chasana, and he explained Inyan Chamar Medina Ma'u. And further on, I'll get into even a bit more detail about the timeline and these Ma'amarim, but I don't want to go too long here with the introduction, so let's jump into it. The Drush Chamar Medina, if you want to look it up, maybe going forward in the future I'll be able to share the screen or give links, but right now we're going to do an analog. It's in Sefer Ma'amarim, Tavkuf Samaches, Chelik Aleph, page Tavkuf Ayin Aleph, Tavkuf Ayin Beis, 571, 572. So it's not printed in Tavkuf Samachtes, it's printed in Tavkuf Samaches, the end of Chelik Aleph. And we know that this is the Hanacha, the way the Mטשערנוביל Rebbe wrote it down, and even though it's a short piece, but it's L'fi it's lengthy in the style of the Mטשערנוביל Rebbe, and as we'll see later, there's also a much shorter version, and when we're dealing with the Alter Rebbe's Titus, there's always the question of, when you have a shorter one, you have a longer one, there's always the question of, did the Alter Rebbe say it at greater length and the shorter version shortened it, or did the Alter Rebbe say it in short and the longer version lengthened it, especially the Mטשערנוביל Rebbe, who even B'chai, the Alter Rebbe, might have been already working on being Mayrach a bit on his father's Titus. But let's jump in, let's go ahead. So it begins, Lahavin Shayrish Inyan Chamar Medina. Understand, what's the story with Chamar Medina? It's not clear, not understood. If mitzvah of Kiddush is Dafkan Yayin, and in the parentheses, it gets a little bit into the Nigla here, that Yayin Goyrim LeKiddush Etayomer, that Mamish Kiddush and wine are inextricably tied with each other, is Mitzayin to Samar Makayim. So I'm not going to get into the parentheses here, it gets a bit technical on this Vart, on this Hagdara and Halacha, Yayin Goyrim LeKiddush Etayomer, but that's what we're going with, that the Yayin and the Kiddush, Mamish, are two parts of the same thing. You say Kiddush on wine, it's not a technicality, you have to say Kiddush, oh, what do you say it on? You say it on wine. No, the Yayin Mamish brings the Kiddush. So if the mitzvah is Mamish on Yayin, K'mayim Azal, Zachrei Wala Yayin, Som Kain, Lama Yuchshir Chamar Medina, Sheina Yayin. So Ebazoi, why are we then saying, why does Halacha seem to allow for the concept of using Chamar Medina? And later I'll get a bit into some of the halachic background here, but let's plow forward. You're going to tell me It's not the very term Chamar Medina. What does Chamar Medina mean? It means the wine of that land, of that country, of that region. So you're going to come and tell me it's not that, if you want to think about it, if you want to frame it correctly, it's not that we're not using wine, we're using something else instead. We're using the wine of this country. The wine of this country happens not to be derived from grapes, it happens to be derived from something else, but functionally, this is the wine of that country. So if that's what you're going to tell me, that in this country, nechshav lehem kiyayin, they regard it as wine. So, and here the phrasing, a few places here where the language seems a bit unclear. I don't know if it's in the Ksav Yad or in the print. Today, we do have access to all the Kisvei Yad. The library very graciously uploaded many Kisvei Yad, but I didn't have a chance to, there's so many angles and details there, I didn't have a chance to look it up and check the print against the manuscript. So the shaila seems to be, lama cholak chilek hadavar, but meaning of that, why, it seems like the question is, it would be more understandable if you say, look, wine is number one. If you have wine, that's the best. If you don't have wine, so then tell me what the second place is, what third place is. Instead, you're sort of telling me it's subjective. You're telling me it's up to Minhag Medina. Go to that country and find out what do they use instead of wine? What do they consider to be like wine? So for davar, and here it says in the chassidim, I think it should say mitzvasei, davar shem mitzvasei, but yayin davka. If it's mamash, the whole mitzvah is a mitzvah of yayin. So why does the then end up being up to Minhag Medina? Or okay, I mean, for all we know, there could be new Chamar Medinas being invented. A new Medina has a new Chamar Medina. How could it end up coming down to that, where it's so open ended? That's the question, as the Alter Rebbe said it, or as the Alter Rebbe wrote it. So that's the question. What's the answer? So the explanation is kayidua, the kol datzcham demim tzemeh chayim adav shebechol chelki haaretz, all the gashmius in the world, hakol nafal mishvidas hakelim detoyu mishimrei mishmarei azayin malachim shemesu. Not going to get into the technicality, but we know there's a general idea in Teres Harizal, Teres Chassidus, that there's Olam HaToyu and there was Shvidas HaKelim D'Toyu. It has something to do with the Zayin Malachim of Malchei Edom that I mentioned in these parashiyos, and there's a term of Shmarim that's used in that context, that it's from the Shmarim of the Zayin Malachim. The pasuk says that they died, and that's connected to the Zayin Midas of Toyu. And somehow that process, that event, that spiritual event, that is part of the mechanism for explaining how we end up with the Gashmias that we have here today. And that's where the idea of the sparks comes from, that the sparks fell and they manifest as these physical items. And that's the reason, this is all Yidul, and that's the reason that Yesh Koyach B'Machol U'Mashkin, and that's why these items have an advantage over us. We're humans, we're seemingly at the top of the world, but we're only from Tikkun. And we need the food. The food gives us energy. So the food has something that we don't have. The food comes from a higher sphere, a higher place. It has energy that can energize us. It has energy from Toyu, and it can energize the people from Tikkun. Eat the food, you dress in the clothing, and everything that you need, all the parts of the world that you engage with for your needs, which is part of the mechanism, how we explain in the spheres of Eilamus, that the world, the physical world as we know it, is noiga da'asiyah. So when you use all those things, the mispal, the loimid, the oisa mitzvahs bekavana, davening, and you're learning, you're doing mitzvahs with intention. So then the energy that you took from those things and combining it with the fact that you're using it for the right purpose, so then you return that energy all the way back to its source, to Toyu, which is higher than Tikkun. And then, as a mailas nafshish from Chinas HaTikkun, and then once it returns to its source, so then that also, not just the energy down here that it gave you physical energy, but then it gives you in the spiritual framework, then you're taking your nefesh, which comes from Tikkun, and you're elevating it to a higher level, to a higher space, to that presumably to that level of tohu after it was metukon. So that's Yudua. That's the general concept. That's the general idea. So now we're going to apply that idea to this question that we're discussing. What did we say? We said that you need machalim, you need mashkim, you need all the things to live your life. And we're combining the physical parts of your life with the spiritual parts of your life, and the physical parts fuel, give energy to the spiritual parts of your life, and that gives a tikkun to the physical parts of your life. So here, perhaps a bit more rarely, we get into the details, the technicalities of the physical. So if you think about it, you look into it, you'll see, we know one person, his nature leans towards, he likes the taste of these peiros, these fruits, these machalim, these foods. And then it says machalim again, maybe we should say mashkim, or like I said, the language here isn't 100%. There are some parts of the wording here that seem like they need fixing, but the point comes across. A person has preferences in his life, things that he prefers, food, drinks, malbushim, other things. And then it says v'chein b'mashkim yesh oyev mashke zu, v'yesh oyev acherim. When it comes to drinks as well, some like this drink and some like other drinks. So we're acknowledging that people have tastes, people have preferences. So how does it fit into what we're saying? This goes back to the same idea. A person comes from tikkun. So everyone, based on their neshama that they were given from tikkun, and we know the torah of the Arizal, the torah of the neshamas, every neshama comes from its unique source. So every neshama, according to its source, according to its nature, its spiritual nature, has a project, has a task of elevating the tzach that fell from toyu, then it adds kavanas from Mesiras Nefesh canal. Not getting into the technical kavanas from Mesiras Nefesh. The point, like we said before, the idea is you're being ma'ileh, the tzach, and the point is then that you then get a spiritual burst of energy from that energy of toyu that's higher than tikkun. So first you get the physical energy by that, and then you use it for the right thing. By that you're ma'ileh, and then you get a burst of spiritual energy as well from toyu that's higher than your neshama alone could have experienced. But you have to have the right kavanas in order to do it. We're not necessarily saying it's an easy thing. So to whatever standard, whatever holding us of what type of kavanah we need to have to do it right. So first we use this to explain why people have personal tastes, personal preferences. And it goes further and says, the peiros, the tvuas, and minimashkim, and machalim, and malbushim, ben kol medina medina. This actually explains the diversity that we see. There are many differences. You go from land to land, from country to country, you'll see that the fruits are different, the grains are different, the drinks are different, the dishes are different, the clothing is different, and every place and every land. In this place, the nature seems to produce this type of fruits, this type of grain, this type of drink. And somewhere else, it's other stuff. Today we live a bit of the, just as an aside, today we live in a more of a globalized economy, so sometimes some of those differences get erased, and maybe especially here in America, where America is a bit of a melting pot in general, so maybe fewer things that have like a national character, but certainly go back to the old world, certainly back in time of Alter Rebbe, the lines were very clearly delineated. You could see very clearly, you could draw the borders of where grapes grew, where grapes didn't grow, as we're talking about wine, etc. So, and past a certain line, you simply didn't really have access or much access to the peiros and machalim and mabushim of the other Medina. Today, some of that diversity has collapsed, and this is something we know in many areas of life about some the aspects of the diversity of the world that have fallen apart, and whether or not that's a good thing. But without getting too off into that topic right now, let's stick to the Maimer, the Drush, the Torah. So that's the reason, Daka, why there is this diversity, because in this rupture, in the process of this rupture, it's chalik lekama chalakim. So when you imagine the rupture, it's splintering into many pieces. It's generally speaking 70 parts, shehein ayin sarim, which corresponds to the 70 sarim, the 70 ministers that are said to minister over the lands of the world. There's 70 nations, and the 70 sarim lamayla that correspond to the 70 nations, which corresponds shehein zayin midas kolach ve'echad kolam zayin, which is the 7 midas. Each one is comprised of 7. How you get to 7 to 70? If you say 7 times 7, so obviously there's also 7 times 10. But we're emphasizing the midas, so 7 midas comprised of 7. So that's this number of 70, and that taka leads us to here lamata begashis behein shiva mini aratos meshunim betivei datzcham, and that's why we have 70 nations, 70 different lands. Each one has its own tava. Obviously, we know from Chazal through not too long ago, that was the framework, especially in Yiddish and Makairis, to speak of the world as being 70 nations. Today, we still might quote the terminology. I don't know if we actually see the world that way, and that's its own interesting discussion of what the 70 nations are. We know that in Parshas Nayach, there's what's called in English the Table of Nations, and there are attempts to identify what those 70 nations are. We're not getting into all of that, though. We're speaking in, there's a certain generalization going on here, that we're viewing the world as being comprised of 70 nations, 70 lands, 70 sarim, 7 times 7 of the midas of Tayu Lamaila. So there's 70 different climates, habitats, types of places. Each one has its own nature. Mashakasu, Viatziv, Gvulas, Amim, Lemisper B'nai Yisrael. Didn't have a chance to look up how precisely we're applying this pasuk, but the pasuk seems to be referring to the general concept that there are many nations, and the nations have borders, and each nation has its own character. So now let's go back to this framework of being Maila, Tayu, to Tikkun. Well, to being Maila in the status of Tayu through the power of Tikkun, as we explained the entire framework earlier above. So that's the Yisrael's job, is to be Maila everything that fell in Ayin Sarim. And that is the fact why we have this process, we have this phenomenon that Yidden are scattered, are spread to the 4 corners of the world, of the earth. Where it's described that Yidden are scattered across the world. So if the world has such a tremendous amount of diversity due to the nefila, the shvira of Tayu, and Yidden are the key to being Maila, to being Metaken, so the Yidden have to be scattered and sent to all these places. We descend for the purpose of ascending. So Shekasher Yala Yalu Lefchinas Hatayu Yimshu Lefchinas Oiris Hatayu Oiris Tatayu Lefchinas Hatikkun. So as we explained, the spiritual mechanism is that when you're Maila, the stuff from Tayu, so then Tikkun also benefits. The Tikkun also gets Hamshach of Oiris Tatayu. So we're sending Yidden to all these places. That's the Yid, the Torah Aliyah, because as we explained, being Maila Toyu is Pashat and Aliyah, Baruchnias. It gives us Hamshachas, gives us Iris that we wouldn't otherwise have. And that's why, so to re-emphasize, that is why the clothing, everything, the food, the drinks, they're all different. Not just is the habitat, is what grows are different, but the nature, the character of the people in that Medina is different. But the people there are partial to, they enjoy the things that grow there. And obviously you have even more individualistic preferences, which seems to be alluded to here as well. Everyone, according to their nature, will be Maila, their part of the world, connected their neshamas chelek, where their neshama is from. So v'achalakim the Toyu harabim kulam yisal l'mayla. So all the parts of Toyu will be elevated. V'chomadin l'fi erka. So every medina, according to whatever fell from toyu in it, that determines the character of everything there. And then every beer will be unique, and every halal will be unique, and then every amshacha will be unique. So that explains why everything is so different and so unique, because it's going to give something, provide something, create something that doesn't exist somewhere else. And of course, we know that the hamshach is the fi'oif and halal, mishum deruach, ruach kanoida. So whatever the character is that you're being maila, so that will determine the character of whatever you're being mamshach. Then connects it to the parsha, and it's the parsha of Parshas Toldos. Yitzchak tells he tells Esav, "Asei li mat'amim," and we can discuss a bit what the exact translation of mat'amim is, but obviously it's lashon tam, which is tasty. So mini mat'amim harbe. It's lashon avim though. It's asei li mat'amim. So the Alter Rebbe is in Medayek, mini mat'amim harbe. There are many types of mat'amim. Mischalkos taimim rabim kanal v'dal, and this is alluding to this idea of being mevayer all the taimim, all the different types of flavors and tastes. So that's the general hezver of this diversity that we see in the world, based on the underlying principle that is more common, more famous about being mevayer than its tzitzis. Now to get back to the question was about Chamar Medina. So surely wine is also from Datzach, so it also has its shayrish and toyu. But what's the main thing? What's the main character of yayin? Shua simcha. It's the joy that wine brings. And Alter Rebbe discusses this in many places. Yayin yasamach. Wine has this power of joy. Lamaila, and in more spiritual, abstract terms, so that's revealing what is hidden. So in spiritual terms, it's revealing what's hidden, and in physical terms, it's being megala a simcha, and that simcha is megala soidus, yichus yayin yatzasayid, and all that. And like I said, Alter Rebbe elaborates in greater length in other places. And so this is what wine is. That's, if you have to define wine in this type of framework and this type of terminology, so you would say wine is the thing that's mesameach. Wine is the thing that's megala the helim. If that's what wine is, so this can be done. This can be accomplished by other drinks as well, other than wine, which is mesameach the lev. But we said that it's very important that it should be reflecting the individual nature of the particular land. Every land has its particular character, its particular nature. So every land, if there's going to be an alternative to wine, it should be something that's dafka in keeping with the character of that land, the teva of that land, reflecting the shuras hakelim that formed that land. The zeo shenikra chamar medina, and that's why it's taka called chamar medina. It's the wine of that country. Medina paelas mashkazu b'chinas hamshacha me'olam atoyu k'moi b'chinas yayin mamish b'makom shayayin matzichulu. Because what's the litmus test? The litmus test is, in this country, what is the mashka? What is the drink? It's this drink. This drink is poil, that hamshacha from toyu, the way wine would do in a place where wine was the wine, where wine is the drink. So Chamar Medina has that power, is accomplishing that in that country. That's the reason why we talk about Kiddush of Chamar Medina. So that's why we make Kiddush of Chamar Medina just like we would make on wine at a place where there was wine. There's no wine, so we use Chamar Medina the way we would use wine. It all comes together, it all ends up in the same place for that reason, and that's the end of the torah, that's the end of the drush. So that's the framework that's been provided to explain why, like I said, back then, you pass the border, you pass the line, there were no more grapes. And Yiddishkeit seems to call for yayin, for grapes. It's like a little hard to understand how you could be expected to do Yiddishkeit properly. So Musman Zagin, that the kavanah in this land is that you should use whatever this land uses instead of wine. Now there's also a shorter version, that's printed in the Sefer Mea She'arim, which was printed already back in Europe by Bukhovsky, who was a pioneer in printing Komine Drushim and Torahs that up until then had been part of the manuscript culture in Chabad, where the average chassid till 100 years ago had his own little kisav yad, where he copied the shtiklach that he came across, that he found interesting. Everyone had their own little notebook with interesting shtiklach, and that's its own interesting topic for other occasions, perhaps. So Sefer Mea She'arim has a lot of these small shtiklach that were common, were popular, chassidim had. So you look at Mea She'arim in the section entitled Imrei Kodesh, Eis Chavav, page Lamed Beis Beis. Kahas actually reprinted the Sefer Mea She'arim in its original format a bunch of years, the last 20 years, and you can find it in Hebrew books. And it's much more bekitzer. This Torah appears to much more bekitzer. And it's also printed in later when they made the set of Madi Admar Zaken, and they made 2 volumes. No, it was once 1 volume, now it's 2 volumes. Madi Admar Zaken in Yonim, which is where they collect all the Drushim of the Alter Rebbe that begin taka Lahavin Inyan this, Lahavin Inyan that. And I have much to say b'chlal on this genre of Alter Rebbe's Torah, Lahavin Inyan, which this very much is, Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina. So it's printed there as well. Now it's 2 volumes. It's Mechelik Aleph, page Reish Chav Daled. I was thinking to read through this as well, but got to work with the time that we have, so I'm not going to repeat the whole thing. But it just says it a lot more. Bekitzer, Chamar Medina, Shviras Hakelim, Kama Chalakim, Kama Mina Machola Mashka Bepedis. It's all you need to say the Chaliyah through the Brurim Lamata. It goes up, and then you get a much bigger Hamshacha, and that's why this Pratim, this Medina has Pedis Amashkim Elu, this Medina has Pedis Amashkim Elu. Everyone gets the Fi'arach, the Bitter, and the Hamshacha that they can create, and that's Vaselim at Amim, his Chalkas Kama Taimim Shoinim. And it says Yain Yisamach Levav, so that's Simcha Malamayla, and that's where we make Kiddush on Yain. But where there's no Yain, so the Oysen al Mashka Shenim Tzasham, Shayidei HaMashka Shel Medina Zu Yuchal HaMshach Gam Kim Malamayla, Ayidei HaBidur Dilamata Vidal. Much more of a kitzer, but you can recognize that it's more or less all the same points. Although there might be, if we get into a few points that seem to have only really been spelled out in the Mittel Rebbe's Hanacha, but the general structure framework is there. And there are many aspects that we could discuss here, that we could explore here, that we can unpack here, but only have time to touch on some of them, and only fi'arech bekitzer. So first of all, what was the main point, and what was the main takeaway here? So the main takeaway, the main point, the main thrust, idea of this Torah was this idea of diversity. There's diversity around the world, and that's intentional, and that fits within the framework of this idea of Shviras HaKelim and Bir HaNitzotzos. And then that specifically is applied to the premise, which was specifically about Yayin versus Mashka, Chamar Medina. So this is even though that's the Chiddush of this Torah, but if you start looking through the Alter Rebbe's Torah, you could definitely find other places where there is an acknowledgement, an allusion to this idea about the difference, the distinction between different geographic locales. So, for example, I recall that in the Siddur, Alter Rebbe Siddur Sharlag Ba'emer, there's a discussion there about the different weather, the different climate, also summer versus winter b'chlal. I don't remember. I don't think it's through the lens of Toyu, Tikkun, and Bira. You'd have to look it up there and see the exact details. But the concept of acknowledging the difference between places, and I believe there's more. I've pointed out long ago that there's certain places in Chassidus where it also mentions the term aklimin, which is essentially the same word as climates or climes that we have in English as well. It goes all the way back to Greek or Latin. And already in antiquity, there was this concept, there was this notion of that the world is divided into aklimin, the world is divided into climes. In antiquity, it was sort of divided in very straight lines. It's a whole musik, a whole topic. So that concept, that topic appears in Chassidus in some places. That's also referencing this idea of looking at the world through this division. And there's also the Torah of Alter Rebbe talking the Torah on Safin versus Darim. Darim is very hot, and that also can be better understood. I think that's how I got into that topic of a kliman at the time, a bunch of years ago. It's the Alter Rebbe's Torah there is referencing this idea of the nature of the climates, and so the North Africa was considered the Darim, and that's where North Africa, of course, is mostly desert, and that was the Darim that Alter Rebbe was speaking of. That's a whole topic in its own right. But so that's also referencing this idea that Alter Rebbe is using this concept of the different locales in the world, and using that concept within his discussion of Chassidus. Someone also pointed out to me that you also have the Alter Rebbe's discussion, talking Alter Rebbe's Madura Basra in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, and I think other places as well, talking about the time zones, the time differences as well, the fact that there's different times in different places, and how that all works. So that's a concept, a theme in Chassidus, in places of Chassidus. Of course, you have just the general idea of Lochach Pizra and Modal Deruchas Ha'olam. So that is somewhat more familiar. You have a line from the Rebbe on Tzak Asa Kadosh Baruch Hu Shepizran Lebeinu Umas, based on the line with the Rebbe. And this is a theme that Rebbe spoke about, at least in its general sense, of the idea that the Nitzitis is everywhere, and that's why Yidden are scattered everywhere. And now speaking talk in the context, the time of the year of the Knesset Shluchim, so very relevant to the idea of the Knesset Shluchim of spreading around the world to fix, to rectify, to mevar parts of the world. And sometimes Shluchim end up in places where there were no Yidden before, and meaning the Yidden that were scattered 2,000 years ago, and they ended up in all kinds of interesting places. But then, if Shluchim today, they end up in places where no Yid has ever been, to our knowledge, in the last many thousands of years. And sometimes you have places where it's the first bris, the first chasana, every Jewish practice. It's breaking the record. It's the first for that place. And so this theme, if you think of it in that more general sense, you'll find this theme in a number of places. The Rebbe speaks about asas lekarta, halach b'nimusa, to engage with the nature, the character, the culture locally, not just one size fits all, or the terminology that's used sometimes of being levushei hamizbater, etc. So this is all on this general theme. For some of the more technical aspects of the Maimer, the Shivim Sarim, the mechanism of Gashmias from the descending from Toru through the Shivim Sarim, Noiga, Mazolas. So that's also a whole topic in its own right. I saw that in the Kovitz of the Koilel Shal Yad HaMaskidus, Tav Shalamet Ches, someone wrote a shtickle on Hashpas HaMazoles and Chassidus, and Taka cites this title of Alter Rebbe as well in that context, so you can look there from that lens, from that perspective. But I would say, in addition to those points, I would say that there's room for discussion about the Alter Rebbe's general approach to the Alter Rebbe's general interest and attitude and perspective towards matters of Olam Haza, where the Alter Rebbe is sort of saying, "Oh, did you ever notice that the world works like this? That there's this phenomenon, this exists, and let's explain Taka why things are Taka like that." So this is essentially what Alter Rebbe is doing here, and it's not just here, and it's particularly common in, I mentioned this drushim of Alter Rebbe that begin lahavin inyan in this, lahavin inyan in that. There's many of them are collected in Mamori Admo Zakon Inyanim. So often it seems like the Alter Rebbe, the premise of these is the Alter Rebbe is coming to say, hey, let's explain this phenomenon, this thing we see. And I would say the most famous one that everyone knows, maybe without thinking of it as quite being such, but the most famous one, which is also cited in Hayom Yom, is Lahavin Kushyas HaToichnim, where the Alter Rebbe spoke about the question of the world being round and top, bottom, and people on the other side not falling off, which everyone has a lot of fun discussing every year when that Hayom Yom comes around. But that Hayom Yom is just based on the Frierdiker Rebbe, just referencing the full torah. We have the full torah, the full drush of the Alter Rebbe, which Tzemach Tzedek quotes, and the whole arichas there. And what's interesting is that the Alter Rebbe actually mentioned America in his original torah, and that's why really the Frierdiker Rebbe took an interest in this torah and the Rebbe as well, and it's a whole topic in its own right. I've spoken about it on other occasions. The story behind this torah and the Rebbeim's engagement, fascination, whatever term we want to use, with America, going back to the Alter Rebbe. But that's essentially what the Alter Rebbe is. That's the premise. The Alter Rebbe starts off and says, "Hey, let's talk about the fact that in America they're not falling off." So that's another Lahavin Inyan in this vein. And recently, actually, dug into the very little known connection between the Alter Rebbe and a knowledgeable, educated fellow, a doctor by the name who was known as Rabbi Shaya doctor. And at the Alter Rebbe's request, Rabbi Shaya doctor actually copied entire pages of the medical textbooks of his day and translated it into Hebrew, mamish 5, 6, 7 pages of Hebrew text that he translated from the Alter Rebbe from the textbooks about the female anatomy, the anatomy of a woman, because it's neget halachas, halachas nida, etc. And at the Alter Rebbe's request, he sent this to Alter Rebbe, and based on the information that he shared with Alter Rebbe from these textbooks, the Alter Rebbe actually changed his psak din in a very common medical issue that women suffered from at the time, and they had ramifications for halachas nida. The Alter Rebbe changed his psak din from the precedent set by Achronim because he accepted the new, more accurate medical knowledge about female anatomy. And this connection between the Alter Rebbe and this doctor is not just known from that source, but Reb Eisel also, orally, we have a letter from Reb Eisel from his own familiarity, from having met the doctor himself, and what the doctor told Reb Eisel, he describes the special connection that the Alter Rebbe had with his doctor and how they would speak about medical and scientific matters. And the way that, as I recall, the doctor described it, that Alter Rebbe didn't have the technical knowledge, he didn't have the terminology, but whatever topic they got into, the Alter Rebbe immediately had something to add, insights that show that Alter Rebbe was, well, both the story is meant to convey how knowledgeable Alter Rebbe was, but it also conveys the interest that Alter Rebbe had in these matters. And my taina is, my argument, like I said, it's more barichas from another sug, another occasion, but my argument is that Lefiyarech, for his time and place, for being the Rav in Eastern Europe in a shtetl at that time, the Alter Rebbe Lefiyarech had a strong interest in science, in knowledge about the world, and you see this emphasis. If you look in the descriptions of the Alter Rebbe in many places, including the Frierdiker Rebbe's writings, there's always this tremendous emphasis that Alter Rebbe was a big maven in geometry, astronomy, things like this. And that means that the Alter Rebbe's attitude and interaction with Chachams Chitzonius is a little bit more complex than you might just assume based on one or two sources. There's a more deeper engagement of the Alter Rebbe with this that has more nuance. Obviously, the Alter Rebbe was still considered, the Alter Rebbe mentions in Tanya, the Rambam, the Ramban, not making a specific argument about, in terms of practice, what the attitude should be, but just pointing out that the Alter Rebbe, as a person, did actually demonstrate a certain interest in Chachmas and in Yedias. And in my opinion, if you look through the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus with this in mind, you'll see that Alter Rebbe seems to have a very active, to a great degree, an active interest in the world around him and in knowledge and in explaining the phenomena around him. You see this in the Mitzvah Rebbe's torah as well, but Mitzvah Rebbe also seems to add even more and do this even more to a greater degree than the Alter Rebbe, and like the Bamish put it in the Chassidus. Masha'enkein afterwards, from the Tzemach Tzedek and on, doesn't seem like new Yedias of this nature were added to Chassidus anymore. So then it sort of got closed, and that's that. And to whatever extent the Rebbeim following them took an interest in the world around them, so maybe they spoke about it, and that was considered a sicha, but it wasn't put into Chassidus. Masha'enkein in the Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe and the Mitzvah Rebbe, you mamish see this interest and this engagement with the world around them. And so, like I said, from these biurim, having in this, having in that, even though the beer itself is not a scientific beer, it's a spiritual beer, but it also demonstrates a certain interest and engagement with the world around, different phenomena around. Of course, you could also emphasize the other perspective, which is that even the Gashmis in the world, the Rebbeim looked at it through a spiritual lens, through the perspective of Kabbalah and Chassidus. But there's still two halves to the coin. You still have to also take an interest in the world around you in order to be able to have that perspective and appreciate that perspective. And it's my opinion that it would be worthwhile to create some kind of mafteach of all the places where we find these types of biurim in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe, which is a subcategory of the larger category of Lahavin Inyan this, Lahavin Inyan that. Not all of them are about Gashmi. Sometimes they're about Yonim and Ruchnias, Chassidus. Even here, Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina technically starts off, it's a Shaila and Halacha. We're asking why is Chamar Medina acceptable in Halacha, but of course it's very much also a question about the world. And we have when Alter Rebbe was fleeing Napoleon, he said many sichos and torahs analyzing the geopolitical reality at the time through a lens of Chassidus. So there's a lot from Alter Rebbe that hasn't necessarily been collected and linked together and addressed and interacted with as its own genre, its own category within Alter Rebbe's output. From the Rebbe's sikh, to make a comparison, we find that the Rebbe in his sikhs used to draw heroes from things in the world around us, and those have been collected. And I remember as a child already, there was a book, I think by Rabbi David the Rebbe's heroes on Yoni Ha'olam, sports and other things as well. So I think there is a certain comparison that can be drawn between that, and just as they've been collected from the Rebbe's Torah, we can also do this for the Alter Rebbe. And in my opinion, I think for the Alter Rebbe as well, these were actually more a form of sichas as opposed to the drushim that he said formally, the Torah Mamon they said formally. I think these were actually closer to sichas, but they were written in the same notebooks along with all the other Torahs that he said, and they have attained a status of chassidus, and we find that even later Rebbeim would chazer certain drushim, lahavin inyan. Even the Rebbe in a few places has lahavin inyan this, lahavin inyan that. You have lahavin inyan arin saif also. That's very heavy. But the format, the structure, is not the structure of a mimer, in my opinion, but more the structure of what you could call a sikha. I also point out that this genre of making remarks about the world around us and providing some kind of insight does exist in other kreis and other chassidim. You have, in particular, Menachem Breslev and Pinchas of Karetz. They have like entire Sfarim, or at least I think it's at this point you could say entire Sfarim of their shorter observations, and often the observations are about physical Gashmistika phenomena. And so you see it in particular, those two come to mind. But if you go through the literature, the Veitlach, the Chassidische Torahs from other, I think every Chassidus really, you'll find there's always something. There's always one or two or three or 10 or whatever it is. There's always these shtiklach where they're making some kind of observation about the world. But the Alter Rebbe, even when Alter Rebbe does it, even Alter Rebbe makes a comment on Chamar Medina or on the diversity, it also comes with the ganze Hezber, B'derech Chabad of Elamatayu and Matikun and the style of Chabad. But there is a parallel to be drawn. That's speaking generally. More specifically, in this particular case, in this particular instance, it seems that why is Alter Rebbe talking about this topic when he spoke about it? It had something to do with whatever was going on at the time on Ma'aseh Shehaya. So, what's the Ma'aseh Shehaya? It was a simcha, and they're probably drinking mashka for bringing in today's terminology. I don't know if that was the terminology then, but Mustama, they were drinking Chamar Medina. And maybe that's how the topic came up, and came up in conversation. And the Alter Rebbe said, "Lahavin, you want to hear what I have to say on the topic? Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina," and everyone was quiet to hear what the Alter Rebbe had to say on Lahavin Inyan Chamar Medina. Although technically the drush does on kiddush, so it's mashma a little bit, and maybe talk about the Shabbos Tanoim as it's called in the Ksav Yad. Talk about the Shabbos Tanoim. Maybe they talk about kiddush, maybe even Friday night on Chamar Medina, so the Alter Rebbe was referencing that. There was that the whole Shabbos was a starke Verbrengen. Back to the proposed headline title for the shir that I gave is that essentially what we also have here is a very, very early reference from the Alter Rebbe to the whole musig of drinking mashke in a chassidish context, because the truth is we don't have till the last few days, till the Rebbe Rashab, we don't really have a lot of sources, even a lot of zechraynis. We don't have a lot of data points about the lived Chassidic culture of what Chassidic life was like. That's why the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Pashtus, wrote so much describing life at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe, etc., because there was that gap. There really wasn't. There were a few stories here and there, which if you're you know what you're doing, you can glean and extract insights into what life was like. But we have very little. We don't have descriptions of what Shabbos was like by the Alter Rebbe. We don't have descriptions of what the Yom Tovim were like. We don't basic what we today consider to be a pretty basic understanding, description of what life was like. We don't really have that for the first Dairis of Chabad. It seems like it wasn't considered a chash of ezach. It wasn't recorded. Versus in the later Dairis. So Lamashal, if not for this, I don't know if we have any. There's a ma'aseh, the chassidish ma'aseh about the Alter Rebbe farbring or the Alter Rebbe giving mashke, but in formal sources that can be traced back to the time of the Alter Rebbe, I don't know if there's much else about drinking. You have the writings of the Misnagdim at the time, which have been preserved. There's a lot of criticism about chassidim and drinking, and it could also be used as a source, but that's a negative source. So you have to figure out how to use the information, extract and apply the information, and figure out what you want to derive from that kind of source. But here you see the Alter Rebbe Mamish talking about the inyan of drinking, practically. So speaking about it in the context of chassidim and specifically chassid Chabad, although since Ramat Chernobyl was there, so you could say it's speaking about the chassidim b'chlal. And of course, we know in Chabad in the last few days there's somewhat of an ambivalent attitude towards mashka. There's a positive, but there's negative, etc., etc. We're not getting into the whole parsha now. But so here we see the Chayyid Alter Rebbe is mamish coming to explain and give a positive, like a framework and a yisoid to explain the place of drinking Chamar Medina, particularly or especially talking in the context of Kiddush for Shabbos, but coming off of a specific event that it was a ma'amad of Simcha. Another point here that I find interesting is the positive attitude towards personal taste, personal preferences. It says, oh, person likes this, person likes that. I think the Lashon was even oyev. Where is it here? Yesh l'cha adam shetivay noite lehoiv. Tam peiros and machal malalu kim b'mashkem yish oyev mashke zuv yish oyev acherim. That itself is an interesting type of language for Torah's Chabad. I think usually in Torah's Chabad, especially in the earlier Torah's Alter Rebbe, there's often a lot of negativity towards enjoyment. You know, the part of Shmuel Munkus to the Alter Rebbe before he got arrested, that and if you're a tzaddik, so nothing bad will befall you. And if you're not a tzaddik, if you're not real, if what you represent isn't real, then you deserve it because it took away the tam and Elam Hazeh from so many Yidden. Yidden can't enjoy Elam Hazeh anymore. So you ruined it for them. So often Chabad is understood and portrayed, especially the Dor of the Alter Rebbe is portrayed that way. So it's interesting to see that there is this acknowledgement of, oh no, this is the thing that you enjoy, that you prefer, and that actually has spiritual significance, and that's your chelik b'olam to be mevayer in the belt. And in a different context recently, I came across another Torah of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe Mamash seems to say, like almost for carrot, where it's like you could be eating anything. The fact that a person, dafka, needs to eat kach v'kach in order to sustain themselves, that like is the ultimate proof that they're mamish trapped in ra, and that's this baruch b'levavoi, shel mi yali, shus b'be'elech, the ultimate level of ra. So it's interesting to contrast these sources with each other, and often, like I like to say, sometimes you see sort of a one-sided presentation in more common sources, but sometimes another source elsewhere provides more context and more nuance. So here we see seemingly an acknowledgement of there is some room, there is some place. Obviously, the mashal, you can give a chilik and say that the person has to make sure that they're not trapped, that they're not held in the grip of their preferences. If a person feels like they're mensch because they don't have what they want, that's the problem. But if that's not the case, then there is an art to eat what you prefer. It all depends exactly on how one goes about it. That would obviously be the general direction of how to reconcile and bring the sources together. I will point out, however, that this one line happens to only appear in the Mitzvah Rebbe's Hanacha, and that line, that extra kvetch of each person likes what they like, seems to be missing in the shorter version. I did not see any remisted in the shorter version in the Sefer Meah Sha'arim. So it would be interesting to think about whether this is something Mitzvah Rebbe added, and if so, in my impression currently is that it actually would be somewhat characteristic, and that Alter Rebbe might not have acknowledged this kind of thing. Mitzvah Rebbe did acknowledge it. And of course, this also is a theme that we find in different places. We find that the Rebbe has a famous beer about the tefillas of Rosh Hashanah, that davening for Gashmias, and that the fact that you feel drawn to an Indian Gashmias shows that this is your chelik ba'olam. The Rebbe uses this yesod in a number of places. I'm not aware that the Rebbe was ever assigned to this mucker, but the idea obviously exists in various forms. So again, that's even though this torah is unique in its focus and presentation, but the concepts that it uses, the building blocks, appear in other places as well. There's also the use here of the pasuk Va'aseli mat'amim, which we could talk about, but really don't have much time here. The Alter Rebbe actually quotes the pasuk Va'aseli mat'amim in a number of places, and it would be interesting to actually see the different ways the Alter Rebbe uses it. But the way the Alter Rebbe uses it here is, we said, mine taimim shainim, that there are many tastes. There's also the whole halachic angle of Chamar Medina, because the whole topic of Chamar Medina is not pashut, but we're really running out of time here. Maybe we'll have to save it for another time. But what's interesting is, that Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch says that Chamar Medina should not be used for Kiddush Friday night, but it's used pas, only the night of Pesach, where you have Dal Kaisis, and one of the Dal Kaisis is Kiddush, and there's no way you can't use pas as a substitute for that. So then you use Chamar Medina. But here it seems in Pashtus is talking about the first paragraph, and certainly in the middle of Rebbe is talking about Kiddush of Friday night. It refers to Chamar Medina. Also, what's interesting is that it seems to frame Chamar Medina as being a mashka hamashaker. That's like yayin hamisameach. It's what's misameach, what stands in the place of yayin hamisameach for that particular place. That's also not so pashut. If you look in the Sugya Chamar Medina, we know the Alter Rebbe used coffee once for Abdullah. We know the Rebbe Shammai used coffee once for Abdullah, and the Rebbe 11 and his Aris on Hilchos Pesach Taf Ayin Beis Sif Chav Ches Sif Chav Tes gets into this barichas. I have the text copied here, but I don't think there's time to get into all of that barichas. So this is interesting source that hasn't been pointed to yet by those who discuss this. Here the Alter Rebbe also seems to be acknowledging his understanding of the place of Chamar Medina. Chamar Medina being used for Kiddush is certainly used it's certainly mentioned even in the short version, although it doesn't mention Friday night specifically, but it does say L'chach Eisen Kiddush al Hayayin, but B'makom Shen Yayin Matzoi Eisen al Hamashka Shenimtza Shem. It's not much about Kiddush Hamashka, and not just Kiddush, not just Hamdalah, but Kiddush, but so in that sense it's expanding it a bit, but also seems to be restricting it to Mashka Hamashaka. And again, I don't have time to get into it, although I have a lot of insights and thoughts on that. Just to circle back around to the context. So we said this was the Tannaim for the Cherkasser, but if you're like me, maybe you're perhaps a bit interested in what was actually the history of the timeline. So we know the chassidim Shemaisa, and says the Bich of the Masmid once repeated this to the Fidik Rebbe, the Kasher to the Fidik Rebbe's own yichus, that the story goes is that the Alter Rebbe already traveled to Rav Nachum of Chernobyl. Rav Nachum of Chernobyl passed away, Tafkuf Nun Ches, is what I have written down here. And this whole incident happened Tafkuf Samach Tes many years later. So, and the Cherkasser was born Tafkuf Nun Dala, Tafkuf Nun Hey, 1894-95. So the story goes that Alter Rebbe traveled to Chernobyl to be mishtadach with Rav Nachum. We know back then they would make shidduchim sometimes even among babies. They got married when they were 13, 14, and the shidduch could be done years earlier. So that the Alter Rebbe wanted to be mishtadach with Rav Nachum. He traveled to Chernobyl, the story goes, and he went to check among the Einiklach, the babies, and he touched, ungetopped the heads of the babies, and he chose the Cherkasser. I saw somewhere that Rishon Munshine writing about this says that the Cherkasser was the Balmeichen among his brothers. Of the children of Ramat Chernobyl, Cherkasser was most known for being a Balmeichen. So it seems like the Alter Rebbe selected and chose the child that would be the most suitable to the derech, the avir, the atmosphere of Chabad. Alter Rebbe chose him, and then Baruch HaMezhebush came to town later, and he also singled out this child. They said, no, sorry, the child's taken. Alter Rebbe took him, he's reserved, and it's not negotiable. That's the Chassidus Shemaisa. But it seems like they didn't make Tannaim at the time, because we see they made Tannaim much later. So it was just apparently a verbal agreement, it would seem. That's the story. Otherwise, it's hard to believe why the Alter Rebbe would suddenly be mishtayach with Ramat Chernobyl. Meaning, Pashtus Alter Rebbe and Rav Nachum Dafka had a very strong connection, and Alter Rebbe wanted to be mishtayach with Nachum. One of the Mekayah says that it's that the Maggid had said something like Mashiach will either come from his oldest Talmud or from his youngest Talmud. Menachem is the oldest, and Alter Rebbe is the youngest. So let's make a shidduch between the oldest and the youngest. And that way, it could be both. We don't have to wonder which one is which. So what's interesting, though, that I saw after I looked into this is that we actually have all the Rebbeim, all the Doros of the Rebbeim, the Shtar HaTnoim, the actual Shtar HaTnoim from Yoim Beis Vayetze. The actual Shtar HaTnoim was preserved, and it's been reproduced in the last number of decades, a number of times. So what's interesting is that the chasana took place actually 2 years later. So the shidduch took place when the Chakasa was a child, the Tavkuf Nuns, before Menachem passed away. Alter Rebbe went to be Mishtalech with Menachem, and then. So seemingly it was considered such a strong agreement that Ramatal was going to follow through. And it came to Liadi, so that was Shabbos Parshas told us, Chavtas Cheshvan, and we have Drushim Alter Rebbe said at Shabbos, and then they sat and wrote the Tannaim, and we have the date on the actual Tannaim. The date on the actual Tannaim is early Yom Gimel Kislev. So Monday night going into Tuesday already, early Yom Gimel Kislev in Liadi. So that's from Alter Rebbe said, Medina, etc. is from this event. We have the Shtar HaTnoim. Bar 11 has, first of all, we should mention printed it in Biton Chabad, but Bar 11 also printed it in Seder Tannaim Eidus and Benisuin, his tract on the history and the evolution of the Shtar HaTnoim. And this document is actually very helpful, very useful, because Shtar HaTnoim today, a whole other topic, has turned mostly into a formality. But back then, Shtar HaTnoim was a real contract, a real negotiation between the two sides, and it reflected the actual fruits of the negotiation, and it stated what each party was going to commit to contribute to give before the gifts before the chasana, supplies, what they're contributing to the chasana itself after the chasana. So I don't have time to get into it, but it's actually fascinating to some extent to actually look at the Shtar HaTnoim to see what the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, really technically, the fathers, Mittel Rebbe and Ramatal, hammered out in their Shtar HaTnoim. Also chassidim that are signed as Edom on the Shtar HaTnoim. So it was like a whole event to write the Tannaim, and so they came. You said Shabbos told us, and then Monday or night going into Tuesday of Vietze, and the original date for the chasana was set for after Shavuos Tavkuf Ayin. So about a year and a half later. Lamaisa, it was delayed, and in Cheshvan Tavkuf Ayin Aleph, the Alter Rebbe wrote a new lashon on the back of the original shtar, adding another clause of an extension of what the update is now, and they set a new date, which was Thursday Vav Shvat Tavkuf Ayin Aleph, and we even have another document, a shtar Tnoim Achronim. Back then there was a minhag to write a Tnoim Achronim as well, like final bottom line that the earlier Tanoim, look it up, Rebbe Levin explains, he has a parak on the Tannaim Achronim, that the earlier Tanoim is still only a degree of commitment, it's just held in place by a knas. Tannaim Achronim, that's mamish, the ultimate commitment. And the date for that one is from the date of the Friday after the Chasana, above Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Zayin Shvat. We have chassidus in the Chasana as well. So, but if you look in the few sources that discuss the Shtar HaTnoim, they don't talk about the Mamarim that the Alter Rebbe said on the Shabbos and at the. So essentially, this whole parsha has not been written up fully. The history of this shidduch has not been done justice and written up fully, examining all the different sides and dimensions of this parsha. So this is my humble contribution to doing so. What else do we have here? I'll just conclude that there's also sheds light on the interesting and somewhat contentious connection between the Alter Rebbe and the Ramatal of Chernobyl. Like I mentioned in the beginning, there's a Chassidus Shemaisa about how the Ramatal of Chernobyl, there's a sharp word that he said about the style of Chassidus Chabad that he said at Al Chasana, and the common nakuda of the story in its different versions is that the Ramatal said, "Yukach no ma'at mayim." It should be ma'at mayim. Why are you saying so much? Too much. The question is, though, what's chasana and who did he say it to? And there are many gersois. In fact, some gersois say that Taka wasn't at the chasana of Mishakasa. some Gersais clearly say that it was actually at the next chasana, because then the Tzemach Tzedek made it. This is Cherkassus, the Tzemach Tzedek's brother-in-law. They both married sisters. Then they made a shidduch where the Tzemach Tzedek's son, Rebbe Yitzchak, later Bavruch, married the daughter of the Cherkasser, and their daughter was Rebbe Tzemach, which is how the Tzemach Rebbe is a product of these shidduchim. So some versions of the story say it happened at the chasana of Rebbe Yitzchak of Bavruch, and in fact, one Gersa even says that it was Rebbe Yitzchak of Bavruch who said the comment Yikachnom Mayim. But most say that it was Ramatul. So if you say it was the chasana of the Cherkasser, then the story goes that it was with Mittel Rebbe. Alter Rebbe was still alive, but the Mittel Rebbe was the Mechutin, and the Matul is the Mechutin, so more like the Mechutanim interacting with each other, and Mittel Rebbe also spoke more, even greater Arichas, so that would have been Matul and Mittel Rebbe, but if it was at the Avritch's Chasana, which is the Soif Yom of Matul, so then it would have been towards the Tzemach Tzedek. It would be interesting to think about whether Matul would have had an issue with the Alter Rebbe style, or would have been more only the Mittel Rebbe or the Tzemach Tzedek style, and Alter Rebbe was still a bit shorter, even though Alter Rebbe obviously started being Mayach once he came to Liadi. And we know that there were tensions between the Alter Rebbe and the Matul. The Alter Rebbe and Rav Chernobyl seem to have been mamish on the same page. There's the whole question, the whole history of who split from whom, right? We know today the sort of Chabad is on an island versus the rest of the Chassidus Welt. That can be generalized. Certainly in Chabad, the rest of the Chassidus Welt are the Polish. So there's a historical question of who broke away from whom, who was Sar Min HaDerech. So part of what we know from the Dor of the Alter Rebbe is that the Alter Rebbe seemed to be very close to Rav Nachum. Rav Nachum passed away before the Alter Rebbe's Tkufa L'ach Liyadi, but at least up until then, and Machlekes against the Alter Rebbe already started in the Nuns from Kalis and Eretz Yisrael. And there's always, Alter Rebbe and Karlin didn't always see eye to eye, but it seems like the Alter Rebbe and Rav Nachum always saw eye to eye, and Alter Rebbe Levitzak by Ditchevtak also saw eye to eye. We know Levitzak wrote letters defending the Alter Rebbe during the Machlekes and speaking as a Talmud of the Maggid and saying, I can attest that Alter Rebbe is reflecting and representing the torah and the derech of the Maggid correctly. Whole discussion of Parsha in its own right. So we actually have stories from the Chabad about how the Alter Rebbe was being makbid on Rav Matul, showing his displeasure with Rav Matul of Chernobyl. So from the Alter Rebbe's perspective, it would seem like Rav Nachum and Alter Rebbe were still on the same page. And I would say also that the Titus of Rav Nachum and Sefer Mereinayim seem to be closer in style. You could see a commonality, generality between the Titus and the Maggid, the Alter Rebbe and Rav Nachum. Whereas Rav Matul, in the Alter Rebbe's eyes, was the one who was leaving that path. That's how the Alter Rebbe saw it based on those stories. So there's interesting dynamics here between the Alter Rebbe and Chabad and Chernobyl, Rav Nachum of Chernobyl versus Rav Matul of Chernobyl. And on the other hand, people have pointed out that it always seems like there was some connection between Chabad and Chernobyl throughout generations, even after it seems like they were on two different paths. But at least in terms of Torah Chassidus, of studying Chassidus, but it seems like in Avodas Hashem, it seems like there was some commonality where the Talmid and the Chassidim of one could feel like they could have a conversation and relate to the Chassidim or the Rebbe of the other. That's its own interesting topic. But now the fact that we know that it hasn't been properly acknowledged and observed, that the Alter Rebbe and Matul Chernobyl spent the Shabbos together, and the Alter Rebbe said Drushim, Teiris, and seemingly in the presence of Rav Matul, I think that adds a lot of insight and nuance to, and this is Dafka late, Liadi, Tafas. I think it provides valuable insight into the connection, the dynamic between the two, and in light of that, we have to reevaluate what the connection was. Like I said, the fact that Rav Matul held his part of the deal and came to Liadi to follow up on the shidduch, and they had to negotiate. They had to have, like I said, the Tannaim was an actual negotiation. They had to have a negotiation to make this old shidduch actually take place. So also, that none of this has been fully, properly explicated and described and worked out. Someone pointed out to me that one of the academics who writes about Chabad in Hebrew actually has somewhere where he writes about the nifkash, the contact between Chabad and Chernobyl, and he writes it barichas in his style, but from what I saw, it didn't seem like he addressed any of this information, any of these sources, so it seems like everyone has, or almost everyone has overlooked this stuff. the whole life, and it would seem like at least Lahavin Yinachamar Medina is probably, especially if it was said in its shorter format, I would like to imagine that would have been especially something that the Ramat of Chernobyl could have agreed with and appreciated, and Shalom V'Shalva between, that's one thing that everyone can agree on. Like I said, it would be interesting to look at the other Ma'amarim and Drushim from this occasion as well, the ones that are linked to Ramatol and to this event, to see if there are other themes of interest, of note, that could also be tied into this discussion of the dynamic between Alter Rebbe and Ramatol, the fact that he said it in the presence of Ramatol. That's what we have here for today, and I hope it's niskabel l'ratzon, that people will see the value and the mila of what we're trying to do here. And of course, I'm very open to feedback and ha'aras, and hopefully, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll keep this up, and we'll see you tomorrow. All right.